8. The 50th year. Spring 2026. The anniversary. Millfield Park. On the 50th anniversary of Thomas's departure, a Tuesday in March, which she has always held to be the appropriate day, Ruth arrived at the park at her usual time, wearing a coat she had bought specifically for the occasion. Not new, she disliked new things, but a coat she had had for 15 years that she considered her good coat, brought out for occasions that warranted it. She had not told anyone the significance of the day, or rather, she had not told anyone she intended to mark it. The significance of the day was known to everyone in the neighborhood. When she arrived at the bench, there were flowers. Not placed by one person, placed by several at different times through the early morning. A small bunch of white narcissi from Jeffrey, who was now retired but had walked to the park before 9. A card from the children at Millfield Primary, signed with the names of 31 7-year-olds and decorated with drawings of benches and parks and, in several cases, letters with wings. A pot of tea in a flask from the owner of the cafe on the park's north side, who had known Ruth since 1988. Ruth stood at the bench for a moment, looking at the flowers and the card and the flask. Her expression, for those who saw it, and several people had found reasons to be passing at this hour, was not the expression of someone receiving public attention with discomfort. It was the expression of someone who is unexpectedly, exactly, precisely moved. She sat down. She placed the envelope on her lap. She poured a cup of tea from Jeffrey's flask. Caroline arrived at 9:30. She sat on the other end of the bench, not the middle, always the other end, which she had learned over years was the right place to be, and they sat together in the familiar, companionable silence of people who do not need to fill the space. After a while, Caroline asked, "Are you all right?" Ruth looked at the park, the horse chestnut beginning to bud, the path clear in the March sun, the Lido still closed for winter, but the gate newly painted. "Ruth, I'm very well. I've always been very well here." She held the envelope, she looked at the view, she drank her tea. The park went on around her as it always had. People passed, the dog walkers nodded, a child looked and was spoken to quietly by a parent and continued to look over their shoulder as the family moved on. It was, like all the days before it, a Tuesday in March, and Ruth Whitmore was on her bench. What the bench teaches. What Ruth Whitmore's 50 years actually mean. People have interpreted Ruth's vigil in many ways, and she has been patient with all of them. Some say it is a love story. It is that, but it is not only that, and reducing it to a romance does something slightly dishonest to the full weight of it. Some say it is a tragedy. It is not that. Or rather, it contains tragedy, the departure, the silence, the years of not knowing, but Ruth has never experienced it as a tragedy, and she is the only reliable authority on the subject. Some say she wasted 50 years on a man who didn't deserve it. This is the interpretation Ruth considers most spectacularly beside the point. The bench was not wasted. The 50 years were not wasted. They were the years of her life, and she spent them in a way she chose, which is the most that can be asked of any person's years. What the bench actually teaches, if you sit with it long enough, is something more specific and more useful than any of the easy interpretations. Number 1. The difference between waiting and hoping. Ruth was not hoping for most of those 50 years in the way the word is usually used, the desperate, anxious hoping that keeps people checking phones and refreshing inboxes. Her hope was structural. It was the decision to keep a door open, not the belief that it would definitely open. The distinction matters. Structural hope is sustainable in a way that desperate hoping is not. 2. The right to choose your own terms of grief. Margaret told Ruth she was living wrong. Many people implied the same thing over 50 years. Ruth's response, measured, consistent, completely unapologetic, was that her grief and her love were hers to manage as she saw fit, not as the world demanded. This is a lesson that extends well beyond benches and lost letters. 3. Presence is itself an act. Ruth did not do anything on the bench, in the sense that the word doing usually implies. She sat, she held an envelope, she watched the park. But presence, committed and consistent and unrelinquished, is itself an act of refusing to let something disappear. The bench is still there because Ruth sat on it, not metaphorically, literally. Number 4. Keeping letters is a form of love. Thomas kept Ruth's letters for 40 years without ever replying to them. This is not the same as not caring. It is not the same as caring enough. It is something between those two things, which is where most human failures live, in the space between feeling something deeply and finding the courage to act on it. The letters being kept does not redeem the silence, but it complicates the story, and complicated stories are more honest than clean ones. Number 5. The bench outlasted the waiting. In the end, Ruth kept coming after the waiting was over, which means the bench was never only about Thomas. It was about Ruth, about the place where she understood herself, where she had been her best self, where the particular quiet of genuine feeling was available to her in a way it wasn't elsewhere. This is perhaps the deepest lesson. The things we build our vigils around are rarely entirely about the other person. They are about the version of ourselves we become in the keeping. I stopped waiting in October 2019, but I haven't stopped coming. The waiting and the coming were the way different things. Then she looked at Jeffrey. You've done this before. 30 years ago, more or less. You did it well then, too. Jeffrey picked up his tools and went home and told his wife that it had been the best day of his working life. She said that was a bit much. He said he meant it. 6. The letter, 2019. A Tuesday morning in October. The letter came on a Tuesday. Ruth had always noted the irony that Thomas had left on a Tuesday and imagined, in the abstract way one imagines things one is not actively pursuing, that if he ever wrote again, it would arrive on a Tuesday too. She had never told anyone this. It was simply a private thought that had existed in the way of thoughts that exist more as texture than as belief. She was on the bench when Caroline arrived, earlier than expected, her face carrying an expression Ruth recognized. Not grief exactly, but its cousin. The expression of someone who is carrying news they were not sure how to deliver. She was carrying an envelope, not the cream-colored one Ruth held daily, a new one, modern, slightly larger, addressed to Ruth at her home address. Caroline. It came this morning. It's from Canada, from a woman named Janet Alcott, Thomas's daughter. Ruth sat very still. The October sun was low and warm on the bench. A pigeon investigated the path nearby and then reconsidered its options. Ruth. Thomas's daughter? Caroline. He died 3 weeks ago. He was 71. She found the letters. Your letters, Ruth. She found all of them. He kept every one. She wrote because she thought you should know. Ruth received this information in the way she received all information that required processing, in complete stillness, with the quality of attention she had given to everything that mattered. He had kept the letters. Every letter she had written, from the Sunday evenings in 1976 through the careful final letters of 1979, he had kept. In Canada, in whatever life he had built after the departure that had no explanation good enough to send, he had carried her letters with him. He had not answered them, he had not communicated their existence, but he had kept them, which is a different thing from not caring, and also a different thing from caring enough. She did not open the new letter immediately. She sat with it on her lap alongside the cream-colored one, the old one and the new one, 40 years apart, and she looked at the park, and she thought about a man who kept letters and did not send them, and she tried to understand the size of that and what it made her feel. She felt, she later told Caroline, two things at once. A specific, clarifying sadness, the kind that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation of what you already, at some level, knew. And something else, something she struggled to name precisely, which was most accurately described as resolution. Not happiness, not peace, resolution. The end of a question that had been left open for 40 years. The question had an answer. The answer was painful and complicated and entirely human, and it was finally an answer. She opened both envelopes that evening, at home, in the kitchen. The old one first, the letter from Thomas's mother in Sheffield, 1979, which she had not read since the week it arrived. Then the new one from Janet Alcott in Canada, which was careful and kind and included a photograph. Thomas, at about 60, standing in a garden, looking directly at the camera, with the particular expression of a man who knew he was being photographed and neither performing for it nor hiding from it either. He looked like himself, of course he did. She held the photograph for a long time, then she placed both letters together in the cream-colored envelope, the original, the new, the photograph, and went to bed. 7. The last summer, 2025. 50 years, the full circle. Ruth is 75 years old. She has been sitting on bench 7 in Millfield Park for 49 of those years and is within months of the 50th anniversary. She knows this. The park authorities know this. The neighborhood knows this. What has changed since 2019 is something subtle but visible to those who know her well. The envelope she carries is the same envelope, the cream one, now very worn at the edges, the flap resealed with a strip of adhesive that she applied herself with characteristic neatness. Inside, the original letters, the photograph, the new letter from Janet Alcott, the whole story compressed into a rectangle of aged paper that she holds in her lap each day. What has changed is that she no longer holds it with quite the same tension. The envelope still comes with her every morning. She still sits in the same place, but there is something different in the quality of her presence, a stillness that has moved from the stillness of waiting into something slightly warmer, the stillness of someone who has received what they were waiting for and remained anyway, not because the waiting isn't over, but because the bench is home. She told this to a young journalist, fresh-faced, clearly moved by the story, who had come to interview her about the approaching anniversary. The journalist asked the obvious question. Now that she knew what had happened to Thomas, did she still feel she was waiting? Ruth: I stopped waiting in October 2019, but I haven't stopped coming. The waiting and the coming were always different things, even when I conflated them. The coming is about the bench. The bench is where I know myself best. I'll keep coming until I can't. The journalist asked what she would say to Thomas if she could. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Ruth: I'd say, you kept the letters. That was enough. You kept the letters and that was enough. The journalist wrote this down and thought about it for the rest of the day. So did most people who heard it. Ruth looked out at the park, the familiar view of the path and the large horse chestnut tree and the Lido in the distance. Canada, or somewhere beyond that. The girl considered this, then, "Are you sad?" Ruth thought about the question with the same seriousness she gave every question worth asking. Sometimes. Mostly I'm just here. 1995 to 2005, the digital age arrived. The internet changed the world around her, but did not change her. Her niece, Margaret's eldest daughter, Caroline, who had grown fond of Ruth in the way of second-generation relatives who are more patient than the first, offered several times to help her search for Thomas online. Email addresses were trackable, she said. Social media would find anyone. Ruth listened politely. She declined, always with the same explanation. If he had wanted to write, he would have written. I'm not looking for him, Caroline. I'm waiting for a letter. Those are different things. Caroline said once, in genuine frustration, what was the difference? Looking is about wanting to know. Waiting is about keeping a door open. I don't want to know. I want the door to stay open. Caroline went away from this conversation thinking about it for longer than she expected. She was not the only one. Ruth had that effect on people who stayed long enough to hear her properly. The hardest year, 2014. Winter. The bench is condemned. In January 2014, Leeds City Council issued a formal notice that Bench 7, Millfield Park, southeast section, was to be removed and replaced. The oak had finally begun to fail in one of the side slats. The iron feet, despite the rust-resistant paint applied during the 2001 refurbishment, had corroded to a degree the safety assessment considered unacceptable. The bench was classified as a liability. Its removal was scheduled for the last Friday of the month. Ruth was informed by the parks officer, a well-meaning young man named Daniel, who had found her address through the school records as she was known to the park by name, and explained the situation with what he hoped was adequate sensitivity. He was 24 years old. He had never had a conversation quite like the one that followed. "We'll be installing a new bench, of course. Same location, modern composite materials. They're much more durable. You wouldn't notice the difference after a few days." Ruth looked at him steadily. "I would notice the difference." "The structure is genuinely unsafe, Mrs. Whitmore." "Then reinforce it, or replace the slat, or replace the feet. The bench stays." Daniel returned to the office and reported to his supervisor that the situation was, as he described it, complicated. His supervisor went herself. She came back and said it was more complicated than that. The story reached a local journalist, the kind of story that local journalists find irresistible. The elderly woman on the bench, the 50-year vigil, the council order, the immovable thing meeting the immovable person. The Leeds Evening Post ran it on a Thursday. The national press picked it up by Saturday. By Sunday, Bench 7 in Millfield Park had been mentioned on 3 television news programs and was the subject of a Twitter campaign, #SaveRuthsBench, that gathered 40,000 signatures in 48 hours. Ruth was aware of none of this. She had no internet. She was on the bench. What she was aware of was the arrival on the following Monday of a significantly larger number of journalists than she was used to, all of whom wanted a comment. She gave one in the manner of someone who has chosen their words with considerable care. "I will not be moved. The council should do whatever the council needs to do, but I will not be moved from this bench, and I will not be moved from this park, and if they install a new bench, I will sit on it. If they install no bench at all, I will bring a chair. I am not a symbol. I am a woman on a bench. I would be grateful if the difference were respected." The council, faced with the public response and the genuine awkwardness of forcibly relocating an 84-year-old woman who had been sitting peacefully in a park for 40 years, authorized an emergency structural assessment. The assessment found that the bench could be saved. The failing slat could be replaced with sustainably sourced oak from a matching grain. The feet could be removed, cleaned, treated, and re-anchored. It would require specialist joinery and would cost significantly more than replacement. The council authorized the cost. Jeffrey, the parks man who had first sanded it in 1983 and who was now 61 and months from retirement, asked specifically to be the one to do it. Ruth watched every hour of the work. When it was finished, she sat down in her usual place. She placed the envelope on her lap. She looked at the park. She replied to everyone. She wrote at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings, longhand, filling 2 or 3 pages with the small particulars of Leeds' life that she hoped would make him feel the texture of the home he was temporarily absent from. She addressed the letters to the company flat he shared with 2 colleagues. She posted them on Monday mornings. She sat on the bench on Sunday afternoons. It had become, without either of them planning it, the place she associated with him, the place where they had spent the hours between chapel and dinner in that good year, talking about nothing in particular, which is the most particular kind of talking. She found she could think about him more clearly there than anywhere else. The bench was their shared geography. 1977 to 1978. The silences begin. The letters became less frequent. This was not alarming at first. The contract had extended, which he mentioned in a letter dated September 1977, and extension meant more work, more pressure, the practical compression of private life. 3 weeks between letters became 5. She wrote regardless. She sat on the bench regardless. The last letter arrived in the winter of 1978. It was short, half a page, the handwriting slightly less careful than usual, as though written in haste. He was well, the work was demanding, he was thinking of her. He would write more soon. More soon did not come. She wrote 3 more letters over the following weeks, then 2 more over 2 months, then one final one. Careful, direct, not angry, asking simply that he reply. She received nothing. She contacted the engineering firm in Leeds that had arranged his transfer. They confirmed he had completed the contract. They could not provide a forwarding address. They were sorry. She wrote to his family in Sheffield, a brief, polite reply from his mother. Thomas was well. He had decided to remain in Canada. She hoped Ruth would understand. It had been a difficult time for him. She wished her nothing but the best. Ruth read the letter at her kitchen table. She folded it carefully and placed it in the cream envelope she had kept for correspondence she considered important. She sat with it for a long time. Then she put on her coat and walked to the park. She sat on the bench. She held the envelope. She did not open it again, but she did not leave it behind either. 1979 to 1985. The vigil becomes a routine. It was her sister Margaret who first called it the Vigil, and not kindly. Margaret was 3 years younger, married with 2 children, possessed of the specific impatience of someone who watches a person they love making a choice they consider a mistake and cannot persuade them otherwise. Margaret, Ruth, he's gone. He's made his choice. You're sitting on a bench in a park every day holding a letter from his mother. This is not how people live. Ruth looked at her steadily. Ruth, I know how people live. I'm going to sit on the bench. She did not say, because he might still write. She did not say, because I am not finished waiting. She did not say, because the bench is the only place where the shape of what we had still exists in the world. She sat on the bench because that was where she and Thomas had been their best selves, and because leaving it felt like erasing that, and because she had decided in the kitchen with his mother's letter that she was not ready to erase it. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. That was her decision, not the world's, to make for her. She continued to teach. She was, by all accounts, an excellent teacher throughout these years, focused, warm, demanding. Her colleagues describe a woman who left the bench at the park gate and became entirely a professional. What happened in the park was the park's business. The classroom was the classroom's. 1985. She becomes part of the park. By the mid-1980s, Ruth was simply a feature of Millfield Park in the way that the iron drinking fountain was a feature, or the war memorial near the East Gate. She had ceased to be a curiosity and become a fact. The dog walkers knew to nod, the parents with pushchairs knew to give her a respectful space. The teenagers who used the far benches on summer evenings knew, with the specific social intelligence of teenagers who never acknowledge rules they follow, not to take hers. The council's parks team had given the bench its first significant maintenance work in 1983, and the man who did it, a council worker named Jeffrey, who would spend 20 years tending Millfield Park, told his colleague afterwards that the woman on the bench had watched every sandpaper stroke, every coat of linseed oil, and said when he was packing his tools, "Ruth, thank you. It'll last another decade now." She said it the way you thank someone for looking after something precious. Jeffrey sanded the bench with more care than he had intended and told the story for years. 1990. The children's questions. Children asked directly because children do. A girl of about 7 one afternoon sat on the far end of the bench and looked at Ruth with unflinching attention of someone who hasn't yet learned to pretend not to notice things. Child: "What's in the envelope?" Ruth looked at the girl. She considered the question with genuine seriousness. Ruth: "A letter from someone who loved me." Child: "Who?" Ruth: "A man named Thomas." Child: "Where is he?" The Woman on the Bench. A story of 50 years, one promise, and the heaviest hope. Most people in the neighborhood pass the bench without stopping. They have learnt over the years not to stare. But visitors always stop. They stop because the woman sitting on it looks, at first glance, like she is simply resting, an elderly woman in a gray wool coat on a park bench, a cream-colored envelope in her hands. And then something makes them look again. Maybe it is the coat, worn smooth at the elbows in a way that suggests decades of wearing, not seasons. Maybe it is the envelope, which is so yellow with age that it seems to belong to a different era. Maybe it is simply the particular quality of her stillness, not the stillness of someone resting, but the stillness of someone who has decided long ago that this is where they will be. The bench itself is extraordinary. It is made of English oak, installed in 1972 when the park was last properly landscaped, and it has survived everything the northern English climate has thrown at it. The brutal winters of the 1970s, the summer droughts of the 1980s, the Great Storm of 1993, and 50 years of frost heave and UV, and the general indignity of being sat upon by several generations of park visitors. The wood is dark and deeply grained now, and there are cracks along one of the middle slats that have been filled twice by the council's grounds team. The iron feet are rested at the base, but solid. The bench, like the woman, has refused to give way. Her name is Ruth Eleanor Whitmore. She has been sitting on this bench, on the same section of it, every day for 50 years. She is waiting for a letter that was promised in 1976. It has not arrived. She has not left. Ruth Eleanor Whitmore was not born patient. Her mother, Dorothy, had often said that Ruth was the most impatient child she had ever produced. A child who ran before she walked reliably, who asked, "Are we there yet?" before the car had left the street, who read the last page of every book first because she could not bear to wait for the ending. Patience was not her natural state. It became her discipline. She was born in 1950, the third of 4 children in a Leeds terrace house in the Meanwood neighborhood, a household of noise and warmth and very little money, held together by Dorothy's cooking and her father Harold's stubborn cheerfulness. Harold worked at the wool mill. Dorothy cleaned houses and took in alterations. The house smelled of lanolin and baking and the particular damp of clothes drying on an indoor rack in winter, and to Ruth, in the specific way that childhood smells work, it would always smell like safety. She trained as a schoolteacher. She was good at it, quick, exacting, genuinely interested in children as specific individuals rather than categories. She taught at Millfield Primary, a 10-minute walk from the park, for 12 years. Her class photographs from those years show a woman in her 20s and 30s who was always slightly turned toward the nearest child, always in the act of attending to something. She met Thomas James Alcott at a dance in 1973. He was 25, a structural engineer from Sheffield, recently moved to Leeds for a contract. He was tall and precise, and had a way of listening to a person that made them feel, in the moment, that they were the only person in the room he wished to hear. He danced badly, which Ruth found immediately and entirely charming. She told him this. He laughed. They were together within the month. The year they had was not dramatic by the standards of other people's love stories. It was domestic and warm and specific, the kind of love that is made out of Saturday mornings with newspapers and Sunday afternoons walking in Millfield Park, and the particular shorthand that two people develop when they have decided, without yet using the words, that they are permanent. Thomas proposed in December 1974 with her grandmother's ring, which he had, in characteristic fashion, researched and retrieved by writing 3 letters to family members in a sequence she would only understand years later. She said yes. Of course she said yes. And then his contract ended, and the Sheffield engineering firm offered him a position in Canada, a 2-year post, well-paid, career-defining, the kind of opportunity that a 26-year-old structural engineer in 1975 could not reasonably decline. He would go. She would remain. She had her teaching post. Her mother needed support. She could not leave. He would write every week. He would return in 2 years, and then they would begin. He left on a Tuesday morning in March 1976, Platform 3. Ruth stood on the platform until the train was gone and the platform was empty, and a guard was kindly asking if she was all right. She was all right. She had the ring, she had his last letter, already written before he left, tucked into her coat pocket. She had a promise. She walked home through Millfield Park and sat on the bench where they had spent Sunday afternoons. She waited for the next letter. The letters came. Not every week. Thomas was working long hours on a demanding contract, and the Canadian postal system added unpredictable delays. But they came. 2 in the first month, 1 in the second. The handwriting was his, precise, slightly slanted, with the particular G that curled back on itself that she had always found endearing. The letters were about the work, the city, the cold that was different from English cold in ways he struggled to explain. They were about missing her. She understood they were love letters dressed in the ordinary language of news.